Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you could please take a seat, that'd be appreciated. I'd like to begin first by saying I'm Andrea Ray of the Jack Miller Center. I'm Academic Programs Officer of our American Political Tradition Project there. And I'm very glad to see you all here for our conversation, Do We Still Need the Declaration? Before we begin, I would like to thank the Free Society Coalition for sponsoring this discussion. For some of you may have already seen, but there are pamphlets and booklets from the Free Society Coalition on a small table by the door. Please consider taking one as you exit at the end of the event. So you can pick those up. So I'm here initially just to introduce our panelists, or our people having the conversation, and our moderator, and then at the end I'll be running the Q&A, but otherwise this is just a conversation between three interesting, intelligent people about an interesting and intelligent topic, hopefully. So, to begin, Yuval Levin is the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy and Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and the editor of National Affairs. Levin served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy Staff under President George W. Bush. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, National Review, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Commentary, and The Atlantic, among others. He is the author, most recently, of American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. Next to him, Bill Galston holds the Ezra Zilka Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he is a senior fellow. A participant in 6 presidential campaigns, he served from 1993 to 1995 as Deputy Assistant to President Clinton for Domestic Policy. He previously served as Professor and Acting Dean at the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs. A prolific author who writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal, his most recent book is Anger, Fear, Domination, Dark Passions, and the Power of Political Speech. Lastly, we are very delighted to have Larry Reed as our moderator. An economist and historian, Larry is President Emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the author of 7 books and more than 2,000 articles and newspaper columns, and has lectured in all 50 states and most of the 94 countries he has visited. In 2023, the President of Poland bestowed upon Reed the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, the highest honor that Poland gives to a foreigner. Please join me in welcoming our conversation panel and moderator.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Special thanks to the Jack Miller Center and the National Summit on Civic Education for this event in such a beautiful building. And thank you to Bill Galston and Yuval Levin for their upcoming performance here in the next hour and a half. The Free Society Coalition, on whose board of governors I serve, has provided a brochure that Andrea mentioned to all summit attendees, I think, or at least they're out and about somewhere in the vicinity of the conference. We produced it because we wanted Americans to think of July 4, 2026, as so much more than just a day to see some spectacular fireworks. The thoughts and debates that preceded 1776 deserve our attention, our study, and our appreciation. I urge everybody to put the brochure to good use, especially if you are a teacher, as we prepare to celebrate the country's 250th birthday in barely, 6-7 weeks from now. First question, our topic, do we still need the Declaration, is written in the present tense about a document issued 250 years ago. We may naturally think of the matter in terms of 21st century political identities, such as conservatives or liberals or moderates, whatever. Does the Declaration belong to a particular group or ideology, or are its values sufficiently universal to embrace all Americans? Does anybody, as our topic asks, still need it? Who would like to go first?
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you and to the Jack Miller Center for gathering this extraordinary event. I think that the the claims of the Declaration are surely universal. The intent of those claims is universal. And I think that the nation that has sprouted from those roots is a nation whose politics is defined by those assertions. That's to say, there are people in the world who would not accept the claims of the Declaration. There are even some people in our country who would not accept the claims, the fundamental claim that we are all created equal, and the implications of that claim that point in the direction of a politics of consent and of the protection of individual rights and minorities. But broadly speaking, all of those categories which you mentioned, conservatives and liberals and moderates, progressives, the various names that have described the parties to our politics, the politics of those parties has been, I think, defined by the framework and premises of the Declaration. And just about everybody in American politics now would at least accept as a set of premises that we are equal, that we have rights, and that politics flows from that fact. Now, exactly what that is supposed to mean with reference to particular contemporary political debates is not obvious. And a lot of the debates we have are as intense as they are because we disagree about the implications of what are, I think, really broadly and even deeply shared premises. So that both sides of many arguments will make the case that because we have rights, it should go this way. Because we have rights, it should go that way. And oftentimes they both have serious claims to make, but they're having a debate within the bounds that are framed and shaped out by the assertions that we find in the Declaration of Independence. So I think we've been very fortunate to have a politics shaped by that framework and that takes place within those boundaries. There is a conservative way to have those politics, and it's been around from the beginning. There's a progressive way to have that politics, and that's been around from the beginning. Those debates happen within that shared framework in a way that I think is very important. The people who've put themselves out of it, they've been people who have made an argument for race-based slavery at times in America. There are people who now describe themselves as post-liberal or anti-liberal. They do deny the premises that we began from. But they've always been, thankfully, a minority in our politics. I think today they're a small minority in our politics. And it is important for the rest of us to insist that our politics do have to begin from the fundamental convictions that are articulated in the Declaration. That's not a way to end arguments, though. That's a way to start arguments that stand a chance of really being constructive arguments.
Bill?
Well, Yuval and I have been discussing matters like these for many years, and I think we have yet to fundamentally disagree. And this afternoon is no exception to that generalization. I wouldn't change a word of what Yuval just said. I do have a somewhat different assessment of our current situation. It is certainly the case that the voices on the left and the right that reject the principles of the Declaration of Independence remain a minority in the country. In my judgment, they're a somewhat larger minority than they were a generation ago, and they are certainly a noisier majority than they were a generation ago, and I confess I'm a little bit worried about this. And so to the presenting question of this panel, do we still need the Declaration? My answer is now more than ever. Because if the Declaration can't be the basis of our national unity, then I'm not sure what else could replace it, right? It is an indispensable document, which is not to say that every American will regard it as indispensable. I want to set the table by building on a point that Yuval made, which I think is an absolutely critical one, and that is that within the framework of the Declaration, there is room for plenty of not only spirited, but I would say searching, not shallow, argument. Let me give you just two examples to illustrate this. You know, we all recite the phrase, inalienable rights, then we skip right to life, directly to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's some words in between those two phrases. What are those words? Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the founders themselves are telling us that the Declaration did not contain a complete enumeration of our rights. Well then, how do we think about what the rest of them are? The ones that weren't enumerated in the Declaration, but whose existence is unequivocally affirmed in the document. And a lot of contemporary arguments about rights, it seems to me, are direct descendants of those two words among these. Second, in discussions of the Declaration, almost all of the focus is on the second paragraph, to the near total neglect of the first. But there's a very important premise buried in the first paragraph. You know, when one people finds it necessary to separate from another, that is an assertion that the American colonists were already a distinct people. Were we? John Jay in Federalist 2 tried to make the case, yes, we were distinctive and different, but we were homogeneously distinct and different from the rest of the populations of the world, which simply wasn't true, right? It was a great argument in favor of an already united people, but empirically it was just false. We were already very diverse, linguistically, religiously, et cetera, et cetera. So what was it that made us one people? And is the answer to that question that could honestly have been given in 1776 the same as the answer to that question today? As the college professor I used to be, I would say, discuss.
I would guess, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, that something else you might both agree on is that the framers and the founders saw the Declaration and the Constitution 11 years later as both being somewhat aspirational, right? It wasn't like this is the final word. I mean, they knew that they were winding up a new system that would provoke endless discussion and debate. And they gave us opportunities to amend and to change and to apply to ever more constituencies the promises that those two documents made. Would you agree with that, or do you think those two documents are really the final word?
No, I certainly agree with that. I think in a way those two documents are the first word, and there is certainly something final in them. I think that the premises asserted in the Declaration are final in the sense, Calvin Coolidge famously said this 100 years ago at the 150th anniversary of the Declaration, that when you read all men are created equal, that's final. But that doesn't mean that that's the end of the debate about who we ought to be as a people. I think of that as the beginning of a debate. If it is true that we're all created equal, what should that mean for a political community governing itself? That's not only not a question with an obvious answer, it's a question that cannot have an ultimate answer, that leaves it as an option for citizens in every generation to understand themselves as, in essence, the ones who founded that society. We're very fortunate that we have a great political inheritance, that people have been living this way for a while and we can learn from them, and we inherit from them a great gift that we should treasure and conserve. But part of what we inherit with that gift is the capacity to make rules for ourselves and to rule ourselves under them. And that's never a passive venture. That's never saying all the big questions were answered before and now we're just gliding. It's always a challenge. Citizenship is always very demanding of active engagement, and I think that's no less true in our time than in any other.
Bill? The
Constitution permits amendment. The Declaration doesn't. And that's a very interesting difference between them. Yeah. Though the principles of the Declaration are meant to be principles forever, the same principles, fixed principles. As Abraham Lincoln put it a couple of generations later, standard maxims of a free society. Nothing tentative about that, nothing open about that. Which, of course, invites a very interesting question. If you look at the wording of the Declaration, think about it for a minute. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Who's the we? How do we hold these truths? What makes them self-evident, right? Self-evident means true on inspection, true without argument. It foundational. You don't dig any deeper because you don't have to. If you're a sentient human being, these are truths that immediately strike you. Well, first of all, there's a very interesting empirical question as to whether the we, the colonists of 1776, shared the view that these truths were self-evident. Famously, there were a lot of loyalists. Famously, there were a lot of fence-sitters. A lot of the loyalists, for sincere reasons, believed in aristocracy. It's hard to believe in aristocracy without believing in a certain inequality. So what they were really saying was, we, the Americans who support this revolution, hold these truths to be self-evident, knowing full well that some of their countrymen and the most of the rest of the world did not. Which invites a question, what happens if there comes a time when we, the people, no longer see these truths as self-evident? We don't have to speculate about the answer to that question, because by the 1840s at the very latest, a healthy minority of Americans were dedicated to the proposition that all men are not equal. And that was the basis of the pro-slavery argument. So this is for unchangeable truths. The phrasing of the Declaration is remarkably empirical, suggesting that these truths are always in danger.
I would add a layer to that. I think that there's a way in which the Declaration, with respect to political arrangements, presents itself intentionally as ambivalent or uncertain of the details. The Declaration actually says that, given the premises laid out, the people can form for themselves any form of government that they decide will serve their safety and happiness. It's a strange thing to say, because if you believe that we're all created equal, and not only that, but that government's governed by consent of the governed, there's actually a fairly limited number of forms of government that could result from those premises. The Declaration wants to say that it is open-minded about those. It wants to avoid suggesting, for example, that monarchy per se is an illegitimate form of government. It never says that. Doesn't claim the king is an illegitimate ruler of Britain, but accuses him in a sense of being a bad king. But I think that there are premises planted in the Declaration that fairly quickly presented themselves as demanding certain kinds of political directions. And I would say that the very basic premise that we're all created equal suggests a set of questions that American politics has had to deal with as live questions since the beginning. On the one hand, if we're all created equal, then we do have to govern by consent. And by consent really means, as a practical matter, by majority rule. Abraham Lincoln lays this out very nicely in his first inaugural. There's only ultimately one way to govern by consent if we're not all going to agree about things. And so, in a sense, the Declaration points toward majority rule. And yet to say that we're all equal also means that we each have rights that are equal to the rights of every other person, whether they're in the minority or in the majority, which means that simultaneously you have to protect the rights of minorities and vindicate the legitimacy of majority rule. Those are obviously in tension with each other, and in a sense that tension is what our politics has had to deal with from the very beginning. How do you simultaneously advance majority rule and protect minority rights? I think that's the question the Constitution arose to answer. I think that's a question that every generation of Americans is, in one way or another, had to deal with. It's why our system of government is not simple. It's not a simple democracy, and yet it is ultimately a democratic form of government. The Declaration pretends to be just open to anything on this front, but it actually presents us with a set of questions which are the questions that must occupy a free people if we're going to take seriously the fundamental premises of a democratic republic. And I think there's no getting away from them. Those questions remain open, and a lot of our practical political disputes, if they're deep enough to really occupy our society for a long time, turn out to be arguments about how we balance majority rule and minority rights, how we live with this peculiar fact that we believe we're all created equal. This fact, you know, this is something that Plato and Aristotle didn't know. It's something that was added to the treasury of political wisdom over time. And yet, it's something that is true, and that has always been true, and always will be true. And so the challenges that it poses to us are unavoidable to a free people, and they're very much still the questions we have to wrestle with.
I agree with that. And what I'm about to say is not exactly a caveat. It's a reflection that precisely because of what Yuval said, that the Declaration is open-ended about forms of government, it leaves open the legitimate possibility that majorities can agree to forfeit an amount of their power in the name of other goods, like the protection of minority rights. And there's no contradiction between the rule of the majority and protected zones of activity for individuals, and I would also say the legitimacy of counter-majoritarian institutions. Those can be popularly ratified and supported, and they are.
I think our system lives with this as a tension, not a contradiction. Right. It is simultaneously true that we believe in majority rule and minority rights. And if you ask which, we say both. And yes, that presents problems. Look around, it constantly presents problems, and yet both is the right answer, and that tension is the way to remain a free society.
I have to say that so far, this is going just as I had hoped. The answers are far better than the questions. The next one is, it is widely accepted that by the time of the Declaration, a revolution had already occurred in the minds and hearts of many Americans. Of the ideas that are, as we say at the Free Society Coalition, upstream from the Declaration itself, which stand out in your mind as the most important and why? What were the colonists thinking that then coalesced into the Declaration in 1776?
That question doesn't admit of an easy answer. But since it's my duty as a panelist to provide an answer that's easier than the question, I would say that the major thing that was upstream was the idea of republican government. That is to say, the idea that all legitimate power comes from the people, not from inherent differences among people, not by divine right, but from the people themselves. And that republican principle of where legitimate authority comes from was the real revolution in the minds of men, I would say. And not everything followed from that, but a whole lot did.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question and a wonderful answer. I guess I would say I think the fact that this revolution had begun before our revolution was a function in a lot of ways of the peculiar circumstances of the American colonies, being very far removed from the mother country, having arrived here with certain principles of how government should work, and then essentially being left to make it work on their own. They weren't going to get much help from London if things went wrong. The Americans were in a circumstance that Edmund Burke, the British politician in those years, described as benign neglect. And that condition of benign neglect left them to develop a set of practices that they also developed into a set of principles. Actually, in that same speech where he coins that term benign neglect, Burke describes 9 characteristics of the Americans. It's a wonderful speech to read. It's called the Speech on Conciliation with the Colonies. I would say, though, that the key principle, and this relates to what Bill said, is one that Burke did not include and maybe intentionally avoided. I think the principle of representation had developed in North America in a peculiar way by the end of the 18th century that was different from how it was understood in Britain. It's actually hard for us to work our way mentally back, but British understandings of the purpose of Parliament were not really about representation in this period. Parliament was a place where the different factions that made up society could negotiate with each other, could bargain through their differences. But the idea that the public was represented in Parliament in some way that somehow ought to mirror the views of the population in general or the electorate really was not as central an idea of how Parliament worked as it gradually became in the colonial assemblies in America. Gordon Wood wrote a wonderful recent book about this, a book about the state constitutions and the colonial charters just 3 or 4 years ago, and really lays this out wonderfully, so that by the time the Americans approach the crisis that led to the revolution, they have in mind that they ought to be represented in a legislature, and that if they are not represented, then they are not being governed legitimately. This was an idea that the British really struggled to understand to begin with, and they genuinely struggled to understand the Americans when the crisis began. And I think that the idea that that is what the politics of a free society looks like was a kind of North American idea. And the Americans took it for granted, having lived this way for a long time, and when it was taken away from them, they determined that they had lost a legitimate government. And if you read the Declaration, the grievances that make up most of the document don't simply describe an illegitimate government. They describe a situation where the Americans had lived under a legitimate government for a time and then had it taken away from them. And the king was not allowing the colonial assemblies to meet, was not allowing laws to be made, was not allowing them to govern themselves. And as they say at one point, he took away their charters and practices. This is actually a very strange argument for revolution. The argument that says we want to recover the form of government that has been taken away from us. But I think that mode of representation, that idea of what the politics of a legitimate free society looked like, really was distinct to the Americans, and because it was there before the Declaration became what it was.
I just want to take a moment, to thank Yuval for teaching me something. That is, I did not know the origin of the phrase benign neglect that Daniel Patrick Moynihan ill-advisedly made use of 200 years later.
Burke really meant it. He thought it was genuinely benign and had allowed the Americans to develop in a kind of glorious way.
It raises the question of whether neglect can ever be benign, or if you avert your gaze from something, do problems develop inevitably, and then you pay the price for having neglected them?
Yeah.
I'd like to dig a little deeper into these upstream ideas and events that preceded the Declaration. There's a movie in theaters right now called A Great Awakening. How many have seen it? Oh my gosh, well, I recommend it. I've seen it 3 times since Easter weekend. But it's about an important Christian revival, you might say, in mid-century 1700s. And of course, we also had preceding that and continuing through the century, the Enlightenment. And so what I'm wondering is, to what extent do the two of you believe that the ideas we were marinating in that produced the Declaration in 1776, to what extent were the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment sort of behind it all?
To a very great extent. But this, once again, is a short answer to a question that invites a very long one. But this is not an academic conference exactly. I think a good case can be made that the idea of fundamental human equality I mean, you could make the case if you wanted to that it goes all the way back to the Stoics, who were read by the founders. It is certainly the case that it was spread and reinforced by the rise and spread of Christianity. Having said that, I think the principal influence on the Declaration of Independence was not the Christian revival, but rather the spread of Enlightenment ideas. And if you just take a look at the reading list of the colleges that the founders went to, John Locke, the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment, and some even more radical Enlightenment thinkers were in the curriculum as part of its core. And I think it's pretty clear that the founders got most of their views, or at least were reinforced in most of their views, by their experience of intellectual exposure to especially the forms of enlightenment that flourished in Scotland and to a lesser extent in England.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think that it's hard to separate that from Christianity and from the First Great Awakening also. I mean, American culture was dramatically transformed by these forces. You can also find influences that are drawn from various kinds of New England Protestant traditions in all of these ways of applying Enlightenment ideas. But I think that what was distinct as a political matter in the minds of that generation had to do with a kind of Enlightenment education. They certainly took a background Christianity for granted. They thought it was important to say that all men are created equal is to say that all men are created. The sentence didn't end there because that did seem like something everyone agreed on. The point being pressed was the point of equality. But I don't think we can really separate these out in the culture of 18th century America. It was a profoundly Christian culture, and also one, especially at the elite level of the authors of these documents, that was very powerfully shaped by Enlightenment ideas.
I actually think, and I don't think this is heretical, but I'll soon find out, that a large fraction of the founders were not exactly Christians. And the God who was invoked in the Declaration, is the God of nature, a God who can be known through the knowledge of nature, the laws of nature and nature's gods. This is not an evangelical view, right? This is, I would say, a deist view. And the Declaration is not a Christian document. It's a deist document, and that is a distinction with a difference, because you do not have to believe in the Trinity to be a deist. You do not have to believe in the immortality or divine status of Jesus to be a deist, etc. And I think that by adopting that deist view in the Declaration, a space was opened for religious liberty and religious diversity in the United States.
I guess I'd say I think that goes further than the document does. I don't think that the language of the Declaration demands very specific theological commitments. But it doesn't simply speak of nature's God. It speaks of divine providence. It speaks in a language that is, I think, just culturally Christian, but also ultimately Christian. And it's true that Jefferson had some very unorthodox Christianity sort of views, and deist views, and Jefferson's Bible takes the miracles out. That was, I don't think, the common view among the signers of the Declaration or the members of the Second Continental Congress. But I would say there was tremendous religious diversity within that generation. Now, we might not now think of it as diversity. They seem to us like they were all white men who were Protestants or claimed to be. But they understood themselves to be very diverse. And the differences among them were extremely serious differences in their time and place. There was real religious oppression in the North American colonies, in Virginia in particular. Jefferson and later Madison grow up in this culture with a strong sense that religious diversity poses a challenge that has to be answered by means of freedom and by means of certain kinds of tolerance, which is very important to both of them. I do think that mode of thinking about the question is present in the Declaration. But the culture that this emerges out of is, broadly speaking, a Christian culture, though, of course, not a theologically specific Christian culture everywhere.
At the very least, just one more. You've all dropped a very important adjective that deserves to be underscored. To the extent that we are talking about a Christian culture, it was a Protestant Christian culture. And another point that Edmund Burke, of course, underscored in a famous characterization of American Protestantism as really the farthest reaches of Protestantism. That meant religious self-government, a congregational form. It meant the liberty to interpret the Bible for oneself without any mediation, without any hierarchy, without any authorities that were fixed, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not the first and I won't be the last, to affirm a kind of structural relationship between Protestantism and Republicanism, which manifested itself in an extreme aversion to Catholicism and a very, I won't say beleaguered, but secondary place for Catholics in the American founding.
Yeah, there is one Catholic signer of the Declaration, John Carroll, but that's about it. And he didn't present himself as a Catholic signer of the Declaration, but as an important figure in Maryland. There was, the culture was certainly very Protestant, and the political culture reflected that, of course.
I would argue that the knowledge among the founders of the religious diversity that characterized them perhaps compelled them toward a system in which government had nothing to do with religion. They didn't want to dredge up old rivalries between religions. They didn't want entanglement of government with religion. And so that was the one consensus that on that issue that arose from the fact that none of them wanted to catapult their faith ahead of anybody else's.
Well, it's complicated because, of course, the majority of states had established religions at that point. Yeah. But I certainly agree that to the extent that the states had different established religions, that trying to create a self-governing people required reckoning with the diversity, which I think explains the language of the First Amendment, which says, first and foremost, the federal government can't interfere with religious establishments.
Those few states that kept a connection between religion and their state governments, that pretty much faded within about a generation, didn't it? By the early 19th century, that was gone.
Yeah, by the middle of the 19th century, I would say it was. But originally the logic of the First Amendment was not thought to apply to the states. Mm-hmm. It didn't require the states that still had established religions to drop those. Over time, we've come to understand the Bill of Rights as also applying to state governments, but that certainly wasn't the original understanding.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it was more than didn't require them to drop their establishments. It prohibited the federal government from forcing them to drop their establishments. And that was a very strong statement of non-interference, which I think as a political matter was absolutely essential.
Conventional wisdom, and my guess is everybody here has heard this in their history classes in high school, tells us that at the time of the Declaration, that the colonies were divided about 1/3 in favor of independence, 1/3 on the fence, and 1/3 on the other side. I don't know, since polling didn't take place for another 2 or 3 generations, how accurate that is. But let's assume for a moment that it was accurate. We know we had lots of loyalists who didn't support the Declaration at the time. Does it bother either of you that perhaps 1/3 of the country dragged the other 2/3 into war with Britain? Trick question.
Well, I sort of like the results, but you know, I think revolution by consensus is very rare, not just in world history. And, you know, so what was the alternative? You know, the revolutionists persuaded the persuadable and overrode the objections of the unpersuadable, and were not very nice to the loyalists during the revolution, to put it mildly. And that's one of the problems with revolutions, is that they tend to remove, you know, even previously sturdy guardrails, and human beings behave very badly. So, you know, am I troubled that people are coerced and their rights and sometimes, you know, their liberties are taken away and their lives too? Yeah, sure, as a human being I am. But I would say that, you know, as a political scientist, you know, there are very few bloodless revolutions. There are very few, if any, consensual revolutions.
I would only add that if you look at the tally of revolutions in the modern world, the American Revolution was closer to democratically supported than most. There were institutions of representation. There were modes and methods of selecting delegates to the Congress, of choosing various kinds of committees of governance. There was also a fair amount of political violence involved, and I don't think we should ignore either side of that. But you know, the Americans had a sense that what it took to make a decision did involve some form of deliberation and representation. But of course, ultimately, the Loyalists in many places were very badly mistreated.
Taxation without representation, as we all know, was a big issue in the 1770s. But taxation with representation is far higher today than what Britain imposed on the colony. So my question is, what's the big deal? Were the colonists overreacting, or are Americans of today motivated by different things?
Well, one big deal is representation, and I think representation is a very big deal. So there is a way in which part of what they were saying is taxation is not necessarily wrong, though of course some of them believed it was, but the absence of representation, and again, I think this was something distinct to the Americans that the British actually really took some time to understand. Their argument really was that they did not have a place in the decisions made after the 7 Years' War about how to pay the debts accrued in that war and how to pay for the cost of government in the wake of it. Now, whether giving them representation in Parliament would have quieted them, I'm skeptical of that, and I don't think it was really possible for the British to do that. They could see that it wouldn't really be possible. The distances were too great, the times involved were too great, and they also had a sense, and you can see this in the internal debates among the Whigs in Parliament, that if they allowed the Americans to be represented, pretty soon there would be more Americans than Englishmen, and that would create a very strange kind of problem for British politics. And so I don't think that means the Americans weren't serious about saying that representation mattered to them. But the Americans are also, and this is still true in some respects, bizarrely obsessed with taxation as an organizing principle of political thought. There's always, and actually in that same speech I mentioned to you of Edmund Burke's from 1777, he says this too, that every nation has an organizing principle of its politics, a question that is the question that determines the legitimacy of the government. And he says for the Americans, as it used to be for the English, that question is the question of taxation. Who gets to decide that some of my property can be taken away and given to the state? That question remained, and in some ways still remains, an unusually divisive and important question in American political life. And so I do think that it was, in fact, an unusually important and a central question in the American sense of why it was that they had to move toward revolution. It wasn't the only question. The revolution wasn't just about representation. But I do think that it was a central question, and representation is a big deal.
Well, I am speaking as a senior fellow at Brookings. I am absolutely delighted to hear my my colleague from AEI describe Americans' attitudes towards taxation as, and I quote, a bizarre fixation. I
very
couldn't have said it
strange.
better
Okay.
myself.
I'm against it, but it's strange.
Historians usually say that Thomas Paine's Common Sense, appearing in January of 1776, 6 months before the Declaration, made a huge impact on sentiment in the colonies. And I'd like to ask both of you to tell me if you agree, and if you can tell us why you think Paine's words were so powerful. But Yuval, you've actually written a book on this, so maybe you'd like to take it first.
Well, thank you. I think that Paine's influence is both overstated and understated. The Common Sense was a massively important moment. It was the best-selling book in 18th century America except the Bible. Everybody read it. It was republished everywhere, and people had a sense of it as a big moment. You can find people involved in the revolution describing it as transformative. But I think that ultimately what Paine did was organize for people a lot of what was already in the air and a lot of what they were thinking. There wasn't much new in Common Sense. There wasn't much that you wouldn't find if you were a historian looking at the letters being sent among elites in that time, the ideas being spread around sermons in that time among a certain kind of Protestant clergy. It was all there, but Paine had a capacity to take it all and organize it into an argument and make that argument palatable to a general readership. Americans were very literate. A lot of people could read. And Paine wrote in a way that a lot of people could understand. And so I do think there's a sense people had that they were gradually moving somewhere, and here was Paine's Common Sense, and it helped them understand where that was. Now, if you read Common Sense, it's much more radical than the Declaration of Independence. It's much more radical, really, than the American Revolution was. Paine makes the argument that monarchy as such is illegitimate, which actually very few Americans seemed to believe at that time. But he helped them to understand the ways in which the debates that were happening were about something that affected them and had to do with a set of principles that they should care about. And I do think that after Common Sense, there's a set of arguments that become the arguments for revolution that had not existed before. So I wouldn't understate how important it was, but Paine did not invent these ideas. He digested them on people's behalf in a way that was very powerful.
Well, in that respect, I think the title of the pamphlet was very well chosen, right? And and that's what a truly influential political writer does. Rarely invents something brand new, but senses something inchoate that's already there and crystallizes it. And in that respect, interestingly, Paine did exactly what Thomas Jefferson said he did in writing the Declaration. That famous letter, to Lee in 1825, less than a year before Jefferson died, where he explicitly disclaimed any originality. And he even used the phrase common sense in that letter, which I don't think is an accident either. Whether he would have used it if Paine hadn't gotten there first is a very interesting question. I don't know. But he talks about this common well of belief that the Declaration simply stated in an unusually clear and memorable way. And I'd say common sense is exactly the same. I absolutely agree with you that common sense is more radically anti-monarchical than the Declaration, which, as you pointed out correctly, left the door open for a kind of constitutional monarchy, a revocable constitutional monarchy. Important to note. But Paine and the Declaration were on all fours in their basic understandings of the authority, the emergence and ground of legitimate political authority. Paine, at the beginning, of course, presents a very straight, familiar social contract view of where political authority comes from. And it comes from the people and no place else and no one else. I think it's an interesting. Well, we'll get to Jefferson maybe. So
Okay.
I'm gonna censor myself here.
Okay. This next question is full of controversy. It goes like this. Critics of the founders point out that as white men, the founders left out blacks, women, Indians, and that therefore the Declaration is a white man's document of, by, and for white males. Those critics sometimes suggest that this undermines its authority. How would you respond to that?
It's not a crazy criticism, but I think it is ultimately wrong. And that Lincoln had this right, and even more so Frederick Douglass had this right, in seeing that in the document there was a critique of the founding generation itself, which became harder and harder to ignore. If you follow Frederick Douglass from his earliest public writings to his later, what you find is someone who begins from that premise and essentially rejects the documents of the American political tradition as facilitating, justifying, defending injustice, and gradually comes to the view that actually these documents are weapons of liberation, that they say that slavery was wrong, and that even though the people who wrote them didn't live by them, maybe didn't even believe that, they did say it, and it is true. And I think that that's, and Lincoln sees this too, that in the Declaration there is this set of principles that means that we cannot really say that the American founding was indifferent to the suffering of enslaved people. There is that word all in the Declaration that just kind of sits there looking at us still. All. And whenever some body of Americans has arisen to say, well, rights, yes, but not those people, the Declaration of Independence just kind of taps the table and says, no, all. And I don't think all men meant not women, and it certainly didn't mean only some men, it said all. And so I think ultimately that the fact of that principle being there, embedded in the founding document of the United States, has meant that for us, failures to live up to the principle of equality have been not only injustices, but also hypocrisies. And hypocrisies are hard to sustain. They're harder sometimes even than injustices to sustain. When you claim to believe something and then don't act like it, you make yourself hard to take seriously. And those people in our politics who have wanted to be able to take themselves seriously gradually came to the view that this had to change. And I don't think that was simply done by the Declaration of Independence. Those words weren't self-executing, but it was very greatly aided by the Declaration of Independence. And that Lincoln could reach to Jefferson and say, Jefferson, Lincoln was a Republican, Jefferson was a Democrat, Lincoln was a Northerner, Jefferson was a Southerner. And he claimed for himself, Jefferson and his language, and said that Jefferson had embedded in that document what he called a merely revolutionary document. He embedded this permanent principle that was active in every moment. That, I think, was absolutely essential to the end of slavery and to fighting all manner of injustice in our society.
That was a remarkable letter or speech. All honor to Jefferson, right? Just a couple of footnotes to what Yuval said. First of all, there is the old maxim that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. Okay, and hypocrisy is practiced with full knowledge of the hypocrite, that he or she, is doing something fundamentally wrong, right? But for other reasons, will do it anyway. And one of the things that I think I've noticed about politics is that it is hard to sustain your position even when you believe it. But when you don't believe it, it's a castle based on a foundation of sand. It will crumble because you cannot, in the last analysis, effectively defend what you don't believe. That is footnote number one. Footnote number two, the critics that you cited at the beginning, if you just take them at their word, what they are saying is that Chief Justice Taney and the Dred Scott decision were correct, and Abraham Lincoln was wrong. I don't read American history that way. I think Lincoln won the debate and won the war for a reason. That was no accident, comrades.
I remember as a teenager in school, I think all of my history teachers impressed on us that it was not proper to judge people from the past by conventions of today, that you had to consider the context of their day, the intellectual milieu in which they formulated their ideas. Otherwise, it's sort of like, let's say if we could bring the Wright brothers here today to question them, would we upbraid them for not putting Wi-Fi and movies in their plane? I think we would say, hey, more power to you. You put us on the right course in the right direction, and you understood that there were improvements future generations would have to make. But this idea of presentism, of judging the past and its characters by the conventions of today, seems to have swept academia. So many young people embrace it. I'm wondering, where does that come from, and what can we do about it?
Well, I am of two minds about presentism. On the one hand, if something is a self-evident truth, it's self-evident for all time and not just for our time. And so the idea of applying standards that you believe to be true to the past in order to judge its practices is not an inherently bankrupt or fallacious practice. But it may lead you, and this is the other side of the argument, to underestimate the forces that were bearing on people who were trying in difficult circumstances to do what we now believe is right. And so let's take what we just heard from Professor Del Banco at lunch today. Nobody forced Jefferson to put in that passage about the evils of slavery, fostered on us allegedly by King George. Now that's a stretch, but that was Jefferson. I think what he believed in his heart was true. That was the Jefferson that reemerged in 1820 when he said famously that I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. But unifying the colonies to wage the revolution was the overriding purpose of the document. And as Professor Del Banco told us, if that passage had stayed there, a lot of the people who signed the document and helped make the revolution would have jumped ship. Okay? Now, when opinions change so that what was controversial in one time is conventional wisdom in another time, then it's really easy to say that back then they should have done this, which strikes us as being self-evidently correct, and maybe is. So the eternal truths are always refracted through convention to current circumstances, but that doesn't mean that they cease to be true. It just means that we have to apply them in a different way. Having said this, there is an old expression that I won't try to render in its original French, but roughly translated, it says, to understand all is to pardon all. I don't believe that that's the case. You can understand vice and still refrain from pardoning it.
Yeah, I think this question is very important when we think about this 250th year, because it raises for us the question of how we should understand our relation to the founders. Do we judge them? Do we understand ourselves as their successors? Are they separate from us? Do they begin something we're still part of? And I think this question of how to arrive at moral judgments. You know, I had a teacher in graduate school who used to start a class he taught on American history for undergraduates by asking the students, how many of you would have been abolitionists in 1840? And of course, everybody, naturally. And he says to them, well, actually, about 1 in 20 Americans were abolitionists in 1840. And so whoever you are, wherever you come from, it's actually pretty unlikely that you would have been an abolitionist, that you would have been able to that you would have been willing to put your life on the line that way. Now, that's not an argument against thinking the abolitionists were right. It's not an argument for excusing anything. But it forces us to ask ourselves, how do we relate to these people? And I would say to you that I think this is a question that anybody who lives within any kind of tradition, political or religious or cultural or otherwise, has to always ask themselves, what is this thing to me? And I think we can start to answer that question by thinking about an analogy to the ways in which children relate to their parents. When we're very young and we think about our parents, we think about them in an almost kind of idolatrous way. Our parents are perfect. They hung the moon. There's a problem, we go to them and they fix it. They can do anything. They know everything. Gradually, as you become a teenager, and I have 2 teenagers and I'm living this
Lucky
painfully
you.
right now. Yes, thoughts and prayers are welcome. Gradually, you come to realize they don't know everything. There's a lot they don't know. There are some real problems with these people. You know, they lied to you about the tooth fairy. What else are they lying about? Maybe they're lying about everything. And maybe everything about them is wrong. And maybe they're just in my way, and what I want is to not be what they are. That I think of not as a childish way, but as a kind of juvenile way of thinking. And then at some point in your life, probably when you have children of your own, you find yourself sitting across from a 2-year-old telling her not to eat pasta with her hands, or just yelling out, be careful, to no one in particular. And you realize, I am my parents. I'm just doing what they were doing. And this is what it was like for them when they were in this situation. And everything that you have known about them gets to be kind of turned around, and you suddenly realize what it must have been like for them. That is a mature way of relating to a tradition you're a part of. Not childish and not juvenile, not idolatry and not iconoclasm, but a kind of mature sense that says, I'm doing what they were doing. It's a very hard thing to do. They were much better at it in some ways than I am, but there were also things that I can see that they did wrong and that I would not do with my own children. I think when we think about the founding generation, we can think in that way. We're doing what they were doing. We're trying to find a way for a complicated, free society full of crazy people to govern itself and live well. In some ways, they were a lot better at it than we are going to be. George Washington was just a lot better at leading people than I'm going to be. James Madison thought much more deeply about institutional design than I can. We should learn from them and revere what they gave us. But you know what? There were also things that I can see they did wrong. There's just no question that we can look at the practices of that generation, obviously with regard to race and slavery, and just say that was wrong. That was wrong. There's nothing wrong with our seeing that. It's true. And yet we can recognize that the fact that they were doing what we're doing and that they could engage in so wrong a set of practices as that means that someone someday is going to look at us and say, you know, in the 21st century, there were some things they did really well. There were some things they did really poorly, and some things were just terribly wrong. And I think we all know, we can think for a moment about what those might be, and we can all imagine what our grandchildren might think about us. And what they should think about us is they should be grateful for what we hand down to them. They should learn from what we've done right and build on it, and they should see what we've done wrong and fix it. That should be our attitude toward them, too.
I wonder, well, I won't even ask permission. I'll just do this. You know, what you've all just said was summed up in a very famous story that Mark Twain told. I bet you know where I'm going. He said, you know, when I was 14, I thought my old man was the dumbest guy in the world. And when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much he had learned in those 7 years. perfect Mark Twain. And, I would go on to say this. Peggy Noonan talked today about Field of Dreams. And, yeah, it was that. But it was actually a much more complicated movie than that, because it really was the story of a son reconciling with his father. That's what the movie was about. And, it was a movie not about, a smooth path to dreams. It was a movie about a very intense struggle, personal, familial, communal. And I don't think that the task of reconciling with one's ancestors is ever going to be easy. And I would argue that maybe right now it's harder than it usually is. I was just reading some survey evidence to the effect that today's young adults are not just despondent about their economic opportunities. They are really angry, especially at their grandparents. That is to say, they're angry at me. Right? You just have to speculate about what your grandchildren are going to think about you. I'm way past that. I know. And we're one of the reasons we're in such a difficult period is that today's young adults genuinely believe that they have been deprived of the promise of American life. Whether that's right or wrong, we can argue about that, but that's what they believe. And this makes that a very difficult moment where reverence for the past is going to be hard to foster when there is so much resentment for the present.
Bill, you reminded me of another great Mark Twain line.
I was afraid I might.
He wasn't very fond of very many politicians. And there was one in particular who had just passed away that he especially didn't like. And he famously said or wrote, "I did not attend the funeral, but I sent a nice letter indicating that I approved of it."
He also said that Congress was the only native criminal class in America.
I have one last question before I then ask each of you to wax for a few minutes on what you think of Jefferson, since you brought his name up, Bill. But my question before that is this. An early draft, as I recall, of the Declaration listed our unalienable rights as life, liberty, and property, and that was changed, apparently, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what I'm wondering is, why did they make that change? And secondly, why pursuit of happiness? Why not just happiness? Aren't we entitled to that?
I can't answer the first half of that question. I'd have to know a lot more detail in order to explain the switch of pursuit of happiness for property, although I have read some scholars who believe that the influence of Scottish moral philosophy on that phrase was decisive, at least for Jefferson and some of the other founders. But I think that they were very wise to talk about the pursuit of happiness rather than happiness for two reasons. First of all, to guarantee happiness is to say that you know what happiness is and where it comes from, and not just for some people, but for all people. Yeah. And I think confidence in that proposition, which pervaded classical antiquity, is no longer as clearly established. It certainly was not clearly established in the American mind. But secondly, and I think more important, to guarantee people happiness? I mean, that would be nonsense, right? You can't guarantee people happiness.
There are a lot of people who think we should guarantee their incomes and
and
a whole lot of other things.
And then if you think that money makes you happy, you've solved the problem. However, so no, I think that I think that the substitution of pursuit of for the promise of happiness represented not only the diversity of paths to happiness, but also the fact that no political system can guarantee happiness to anybody, let alone everybody.
Yuval?
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And I think a right to happiness would be a very peculiar kind of political idea. I do think that in thinking about life, liberty, and property, which is a phrase that John Locke uses, that's his trilogy. I think there's a way that property plays that crazy role in English political thought that taxation plays in American political thought. When they say property, they really do mean freedom. And that goes very far back to the Magna Carta and before. And I think that was never quite the same for that generation of Americans, and that the language of happiness and the pursuit of happiness becomes strangely sort of prevalent, especially in Virginia in that generation, as a way of talking about what it is that political freedom really amounts to. The phrase pursuit of happiness before the Declaration appears in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which, as I understand it, was written by George Mason. It doesn't seem like Thomas Jefferson was an author of it, but he was certainly well aware of it, and I think was taken by that notion. Happiness appears twice in the Declaration. It's a strange word to have in such a document, in a way, but in both cases it describes something of the purpose of government and the goal that people are seeking in pursuing a free government. But it is a pursuit. It's not an outcome that you can guarantee.
Quick thoughts on Thomas Jefferson, so central to this whole story, before we open to questions from the audience. What do you think of him?
Well, that's a very complicated question. Look, I think Thomas Jefferson was an extraordinary figure, and just one of these impossible people that generation somehow was so full of. And it's even more extraordinary when you see him not in retrospect the way we do, but when you think about who he was coming into that moment in the Second Continental Congress. He was young, he was in his 30s, he was shy. For a politician, he was always shy, and certainly as a young man. He did not have much to say in Congress, and yet he did a lot of writing. It became clear that he was a great writer to a lot of the people involved. John Adams thought that he ought to write the Declaration, that Jefferson ought to, which is a very strange thing for John Adams to have done. He was not otherwise in the habit of turning over important roles to other people. He thought it should be done by a Southerner, and later said that he believed Jefferson was a better writer than himself. But Jefferson wasn't just a great writer. He was a committed Enlightenment liberal of a sort that even in that time and place was pretty unusual. And that he was given the pen and that what he wrote was then adopted by the Congress really suggests something pretty extraordinary about the mindset of the people involved. I think we were lucky to have him there. Obviously, he was a complicated person and a hypocrite on the question of slavery. I don't think we should run away from that. That's true. But Jefferson also had a sense, I think, a perception of the injustice involved that he wasn't always able to keep himself from expressing. And that was even true in his original draft of the Declaration.
Well, since we're into being American today, I will quote one of my favorite episodes in the Marx Brothers oeuvre, where Groucho is the head of an impecunious liberal arts college, so impecunious that the only commencement speaker they can afford is him. And he delivers this impassioned oration, at the end of which he says, "And these, ladies and gentlemen, are my principles. And if you don't like them, I've got others." Well, Thomas Jefferson reminds me a little bit of Groucho, because I think there's, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, his presidency does not appear as one of his signature achievements on his gravestone.
That's right.
I think there's a reason for that. And that is that as president, Jefferson proved himself to be a man of, shall we say, flexible principle. And I offer as Exhibit A the Louisiana Purchase, which flatly contradicted everything that Jefferson had ever said about presidential authority, but he did it anyway. It was a great deal, right? How could he turn it down? And he was right. The decision was correct for the common good and future prosperity of the country. The fact that he really didn't hesitate to do it, tells me something. And maybe if you're a man of fixed principles, you're not entirely suited to be president. On the other hand, Abraham Lincoln was a man of fixed principles who was entirely suited to be president. So that's my reflection on Thomas Jefferson.
Probably the embargo would be another good example of his flexibility. He came to regret that as well. Well, we now turn to questions from the audience in the roughly 15 minutes we have left. And I believe, Andrea, you're going to take charge of that?
Yeah, so just raise your hand. I'll call on you. We have 2 mic runners who will be bringing mics to you. So perhaps this gentleman right here first.
So the question I have, and this may provoke a difference between the two of you, is which is more responsible for shaping the political ethos of the country? Is it the Constitution or is it the Declaration of Independence? And the reason I ask that is because, Yuval, in your book, you stress very much the importance of the Constitution. You say that acting together is more important than believing alike, and that you refer to the Declaration of Independence, but you kind of downplay it a bit. So I wonder if you still think the same as you did then, and whether you two share the same perspective on that question.
Yeah, I certainly don't intend to downplay it. And in fact, in suggesting that ultimately in our kind of politics, unity means not thinking alike, but acting together, I do argue there in the book that Americans are not, that's not to say that Americans are strangers to each other, that there's nothing we agree about, and we're just finding ways to act together. We are one nation. There is such a thing as an American in the world. Just ask anybody else in the world, and they'll tell you there is such a thing as an American. And we often, I think, overstate our differences. And a lot of the reasons for that have to do with the fact that we do begin from a set of premises. Our politics tend to be fought within the 40-yard lines. We say we disagree very profoundly, but we disagree less radically than many other, even free societies. And I think a lot of that has to do with beginning from a set of commitments that are in the Declaration of Independence. I think ultimately that the Declaration establishes the necessary premises for the Constitution. I think those premises are not negotiable. The Constitution is negotiable. It was negotiated. It's not the only way to run a country. I think it's a very good way, and it's our way, and we should work with it. But I think that the premises that we find in that core, beautiful second paragraph of the Declaration are just true. And that can be our beginning is an enormous source of strength for our country and ought to be an enormous object of gratitude for us. So I love the Constitution and I defend it, but I think the Declaration matters more.
Up front, please.
Hi, you've both talked about the tension between the majority and minority rights. And if you look at the language up to the point where we talk about the establishment of government, we talk about government is there to secure these rights. Would you agree that the lead up into that is all about what I'll call respect for the dignity and the moral agency of individuals? And then the challenge becomes, okay, how do we protect that? It says to secure these rights. And does that put a constraint on the role of government that in somehow forces you to revisit, well, what are unalienable rights and what do they mean? And how does that play out in that tension?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question. I guess I would start in a different place. The Declaration starts with the people, not with the individual. At the beginning of the Declaration, we look at a world in which there are peoples, there are nations. And the Declaration asserts that we have reached a moment where it's necessary for one people to separate from another. And in doing that, the Declaration then articulates a set of principles that it thinks ought to define our politics. Those are about individuals, and there's no question that in asking the question of what ultimately is the purpose of government, that purpose is organized around the need to protect and secure the rights of individuals, but it is also organized around the need for nations to govern themselves as nations. And when the Declaration sort of adds these up, there is an argument that says that while governments have to answer to the consent of the governed, exactly how that's done is a matter for a people to determine for itself. So this is why I say I think the Declaration effectively demands some form of democratic governance. Government by consent is democratic government, and is ultimately, as a practical matter, probably government by some form of majority rule. But to say that governments exist to secure rights is to say that the reason we tolerate all that is that we as individuals have certain essential rights that have to be protected. These things are just obviously in tension. They seem like they come from two different sorts of political theory. And I think the Declaration and the Constitution and the American political tradition just wants to say, yes, there's a tension here. Live with the tension, because all the alternatives to putting up with that tension are worse. Putting up with that tension is not easy. It creates a politics that's very contentious, where everybody has legitimate arguments to make about what it might look like to do these things that governments have to do, but all the alternatives look like various forms of oppression. And so I think that tension is just inescapable, and it's not, the Declaration is not simply about individual rights, and it's not simply about governance on a broad scale. It really is about both, even while it recognizes that that's not an easy tension to sustain.
I'd add only that in specifying that governments are instituted to secure these rights, I think the Declaration is saying that is the only legitimate purpose of government, and therefore we are not in the business of promoting virtue through government necessarily. We're not in the business of promoting religion through government necessarily. It may be that some of that is required in order to secure rights, but if that's not the case, then this is not a republic of virtue that's being created here. It's something else, it's something distinctive, and that's what's so crazily experimental about it, because I don't think that any previous people would have answered the question about what the legitimate purpose of government is in that way.
So I think there is a place for an idea of virtue in the political thinking of that generation. Of course, individuals varied. It was less important for Jefferson. It was more important for Adams and the New Englanders. The Declaration does also say that in thinking about forms of government, people should have in mind what will best advance their safety and happiness. And that's certainly meant to work alongside the idea that governments exist to secure rights, primarily. I don't think anything would be acceptable that would contradict that. But I don't think we can work our way to the political thinking of that generation without some idea of virtue. Now there is, it seems to me, a distinctly American 18th century idea of virtue, which has a lot to do with the, I would define what's distinct about their idea of virtue as understanding virtue as the strength to play your part, the strength to be a citizen, the strength to be a leader, the strength to play your particular part in society. This is an idea that's shaped by Puritanism. It's shaped by the English political tradition. There's a lot of work to be done there, and I've written about this. I'm happy to bore you about it if you'd like. But I wouldn't separate that political vision from an understanding of virtue. And I think happiness actually encompasses a certain conception of the good, but there's no coercion in that vision. And I do think that's very important. Classical politics in thinking about virtue thought in terms of coercion. American political thought has not had room for coercion, I think, from the very start.
To be continued.
We have time for one more question. Perhaps Sebastian in the back.
apologize. I don't know if I should be the last question of the evening or, yeah, evening. But I want to keep exploring what you guys were exploring, and I can't help but think that the Declaration of Independence does make mention of virtue that is going to be essential for a people, and that's prudence. Seems like that one would be a necessary one. Thoughts?
Yeah, you know, there's a way of thinking about virtue as consisting of virtues in the plural. And there's a way of thinking about virtue as its own distinct political concept. I think that peculiar fact has been present in the idea of virtue from the very beginning. You know, when Plato talks about virtue, he's got 4 cardinal virtues. Aristotle has 11. And yet they each also want to say there is such a thing as virtue, per se, that unites these. And to be a virtuous person isn't just to display some of these virtues, it's to have a quality that combines them. And I would say that in the classical tradition, and for Aristotle in particular, what combines them is what he calls practical wisdom, prudence. Prudence isn't just one of the virtues, it's what makes it possible for a single person to embody the virtues in general. And so it is interesting and important that the Declaration, in moving from principle to practice, right, after laying out what's required for a government to be legitimate, the Declaration kind of stops itself from saying, and therefore any government that doesn't work this way should be overthrown, which is what Tom Paine says in Common Sense. The Declaration says prudence dictates that we only overthrow a government when it's absolutely necessary. And the rest of the Declaration describes why they think it's absolutely necessary. That's what all those grievances are doing there. So I do think there's a way in which prudence restrains the direct application of principle into practice. But it doesn't resolve for us the question of whether the politics of that generation is fundamentally a kind of virtue politics, or something different, something newer and more liberal than that.
Well, whenever I'm asked a question about American government, in the tradition of my tribe, I answer that question with a question, and that is, what would James Madison say? And I think carefully analyzing the role that James Madison expected virtue to play in the Constitution is not the end of wisdom, but it's certainly the beginning of it. And I would summarize Madison's view as this: it's nice when you can find it, but don't count on it. And we better construct institutions that are less vulnerable to vice than the republics of yore.
Larry, anything? Or, okay. On that note, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. This has been a lovely discussion.